The patrons have spoken and they've bestowed Avalugg upon us. It's often referred to as the table Pokemon, which, while not entirely inaccurate, doesn't exactly convey the depth of its design either. Its inspirations range from a tabular iceberg, specifically the submerged part, which is much bigger than which rises above water, as well as an aircraft carrier, which in conjunction with its ice typing may refer to Project Habakkuk, an allied plan from World War II to build an aircraft carrier from a combination of ice and wood pulp. It goes to show you can't judge a table by its surface, at least not entirely. It also has a Hisuian form, which at the time of this video has still not been released yet, though it does seem quite interesting, as it gains partial rock typing. Today we're going to examine base Avalugg in the competitive scene, and so we ask, how good was Avalugg actually? And in this video we'll be going over these competitive formats. When one looks at Avalugg's stats, its eye-popping base 184 defense jumps out at you. To comprehend the sheer enormity of this stat, consider how it leaves Deoxys defense and Primal Groudon both sitting at base 160 in the dust. It's even higher than Aggron, Cloyster, and Mega Slowbro, each of whom sit at a whopping base 180. There are only a few Pokemon with more defense, like Shuckle, but unlike Shuckle, Avalugg does not have its gigantic defense ruined by abysmal HP. In fact, its base 95 HP stat is downright excellent. It's the same as Clefable and Slowbro. Also like Clefable and Slowbro, Avalugg packs reliable instant healing with Recover, making repeated hit taking a cinch. It brings excellent utility to its team too, because it's got one of the best support moves in the game, none other than the hazard clearing Rapid Spin. On top of that, Avalugg is no weak passive wall either. It boasts an excellent base 117 attack, which is higher than threatening physical attackers like Entei and Kabutops. And with this attack stat, it wields the excellent coverage of Earthquake and Stab Ice. With all of these tremendous traits in hand, Avalugg seemed poised for success. Of course, every Pokemon has weak points, but some Pokemon's weak points are far more pronounced than others, and Avalugg is a prime example. From day one, its aforementioned good areas struggled to leave any substantial impact, drowned out as they were by its many crippling flaws. Its special defense and speed were abysmal, but as a physical wall, that wasn't necessarily backbreaking. Its Ice Stab being restricted to Avalanche, on the other hand, was a lot more difficult to reconcile with, since dealing with it would be much easier if it couldn't hit hard. Avalanche clocked in at a paltry 70 base power, only gaining its double damage effect if the opponent had attacked it on the same turn, making it incredibly easy to play around. Avalugg's greatest drawback by far, however, was related to the fact that it had Ice Stab at all. You guessed it, it was a defensive Pokemon with Ice typing, otherwise known as the worst in the game. Resisting Ice is, of course, quite valuable, but generally you'd like to have just a little bit more than just that one resist. However, this in and of itself also wasn't necessarily backbreaking. With bulk like Avalugg's, it was going to shrug off Outrages, Crunches, and Earthquakes with ease, so simply being neutral to physical moves would do just fine. Think of Generation 4 Clefable, which was neutral to just about everything, yet felt downright unkillable. Then again, that's exactly it. Clefable was neutral to nearly everything, and Avalugg certainly wasn't, instead packing weaknesses to nasty, common, powerful physical attacking types like Fighting, Steel, Fire, and Rock, which were incredibly popular as coverage, if not outright stab. But worst of all, that Rock weakness meant it possessed not just a vulnerability to Stone Edge, but Stealth Rock as well. Walls with Rock weaknesses can still function, even Ice types, rarely, but they have to be really excellent, and Avalugg with weaknesses galore was not. To top things off, Gen 6's Defog buff meant that even one of the crown jewels of Avalugg's move pool, Rapid Spin, wasn't nearly as valuable as it would have been in a previous generation, and so Avalugg tumbled through the tiering rung, with barely anyone noticing, for there was nearly no use for a physically defensive Rapid Spinner with such hindering weaknesses in the era of Defog in any metagame. Even in the lowest tier of all, PU, Avalugg's niche was mostly cursory, more acknowledged as technically existing without much of anyone actually using it, because it just wasn't very good at doing what it was supposed to. At first it seemed good against Stoutland, one of the scariest threats around, but then there was the Rock's weakness and Stoutland's proclivity for Choice Band superpower, and it could go wrong very quickly, so why use it? The reward was minimal, the risk was high, and thus Gen 6 mostly passed Avalugg by. Generation 7 was mostly a repeat of its debut for Avalugg. Bad typing, weak and slow, rapid spin unnecessary in the age of the fog, except this time it didn't even maintain its previous cursory PU status, falling to untiered this time. We won't rehash that any further. Instead, we will focus on the brief yet utterly glorious moment where Avalugg didn't just appear, but thrived in OU. Yes, you heard right, OU, the standard metagame, home of Heatran, Ferrothorn, Rotom Wash, all the usual suspects. How did this come about, you wonder? Well, Generation 7's addition of Z-moves had unleashed the ludicrous power of Kyurem Black's Freeze Shock turned Sub-Zero Slammer, one of the most monstrous moves in the tier, slicing through even most resists, while the few resists capable of taking it were shredded by Kyurem Black's coverage moves. For offensive teams, this wasn't anything particularly noteworthy. Their lack of reliance on defensive tactics meant there were plenty of Pokemon they knew they'd have to sacrifice against it, should it get a free turn. You didn't exactly pack a hard wall for something like Choice Specs Tapu Lele on offense after all. You limited its switch-ins to begin with through offensive pressure, and if you did have to give up a Pokemon when it switched in, so be it. You'd compensate by retaliating with your own offensive pressure. Defensive teams, of course, did not function like this. They relied on being able to take hits from whatever they faced, and thus Z Kyurem Black was one of the scariest Pokemon for them, famously unwallable as it was. Sure, Sub-Zero Slammer was one-time use, but being able to force one KO against a defensive team reliant on all its pieces would quickly start a domino effect, almost impossible to recover from, as the defensive team would haplessly collapse from continued pressure. That's where Avalugg came in. With its enormous defense and ice resistance, it shrugged Sub-Zero Slammer off like nothing, and just as importantly, it didn't fear Kyurem Black's coverage either. Fusion Bolt did laughable damage even in electric terrain. Despite being super effective, Iron Head bounced off as well. Earth Power may have hit Avalugg on its weaker special defense stat, but it wasn't strong enough to break through. Avalugg could even invest in a few special defense EVs to avoid the 2-hit KO from the rare Hidden Power Fire. Most of the time though, it was facing all physical Kyurem Black and it didn't break a sweat fighting it. Kyurem Black wasn't even the only so-called unwallable Pokemon Avalugg took on either. It beat most variants of Mega Mawile as well. But what about Stealth Rock, you ask? Well, Avalugg was used on heavy stall teams, which already heavily relied on tactics like multiple defoggers and Mega Sableye to thwart entry hazards that would otherwise compromise the walling ability of staples like Chansey. Thus, it was well supported in this regard. Plus, its rapid spin was actually quite useful, as it completely shut down a Stealth Rocker otherwise incredibly difficult for defense to stop, Mega Swampert in Rain. Avalugg was also great against two other incredibly common Pokemon that were threats and Stealth Rockers alike, Landorus, Therian, and Garchomp. Speaking of dangerous threats Avalugg stopped, it completely devoured Zygarde while it was in the tier. Avalugg wound up with a legitimately good, important place on stall teams. So legitimate, it even saw success in tournament play. Sadly, this did not last. Avalugg, though decent, was quite reliant on its teammates facilitating ideal, hazardless field conditions for it, and when that crumbled, it would too. The Zygarde ban also meant it lost a crucial defensive target. Bulky teams thus started turning to anti-Kyurem Black measures that were more generally robust. Wish Protect Jirachi saw a surge in usage and was also valued for its ability to take on Specs Tapu Lele. Mega Aggron also became more popular as it was solid at taking on both Kyurem Black and Mega Mawile alike. Nevertheless, Avalugg had its time as not just viable, but genuinely tournament-worthy in Gen 7 OU. Gen 8 gave Avalugg reason to be excited, as the addition of heavy-duty boots meant it would no longer have to contend with Stealth Rock. The walling potential of Avalugg unhindered by rocks was quickly seen in OU, as it was used on a handful of occasions. It didn't match up too well against the metagame, but it was one of the few things that could withstand icicle crashes from the absurdly broken Galarian Darmanitan. Of course, it had to fear Flare Blitz, but that was just G-Darm being broken for you. Being able to stop it from spamming icicle crash was half the battle. There wasn't much place for Avalugg in OU after G-Darm was banned, of course. Sure, it could check things like Excadrill in a pinch, but players generally preferred other options like Corviknight. But it had already gotten the generation off to a good start, and it had also received another new tool which it could potentially put to great use: Body Press, a fighting move with 80 base power that attacked with its user's defense stat. That's right, when using Body Press, Avalugg was one of the strongest physical attackers in the game. Finally, Avalugg even received new, better Ice Stab in the form of Icicle Spear. Sadly, Avalugg was generally underwhelming. It had flashes of being solid, of course, as in early UU, it was a decent hit taker against common physical attackers. Then it found itself in RU, and then NU, solidifying that position in the Isle of Armor, and even winding up in PU in the Crown tundra. Its problem was that no matter what tier it found itself in, it kept following the same trajectory. Early, players would admire its ability to stave off physical attackers. Then they'd realize just how badly its many flaws hinder it. Its usage wouldn't immediately careen off a cliff, but it'd slowly be used less and less until it found itself in the tier below. Rinse and repeat. Even with body presses on paper huge power, Avalugg wasn't very threatening and wound up being quite passive, which deterred players from using it. Being slow and having so many easily exploitable weaknesses will do that. Furthermore, the heavy-duty boots that let Avalugg switch in more easily actually led to the decrease in its value in a way. Since boots were used on so many Pokemon, its hazard-clearing rapid spin wasn't really needed. It was also utterly terrified of knockoff, since its walling ability was completely contingent on having boots, meaning it had to be really careful about switching in and remaining on the field, making it even easier to play around and eventually leading the player base to the cross-tier realization that using Avalugg was more trouble than it was worth. As a result, Avalugg wound up in untiered once again. Generation 9's Terastallization was potentially Avalugg's saving grace. It could shed the ice typing that plagued it so, finally channeling its huge physical bulk into a typing that could actually use it, especially since Avalugg still maintains the benefit of Ice Stab after Terastallizing, and even received a better new move for the job in Ice Spinner. The problem is, of course, that Pokemon used for Terastallization tend to be offensive threats, and no type change will change how slow and specially frail Avalugg is. And good defensive Terastallizing Pokemon tend to be those that are good defensively to begin with. Avalugg, not so much. When you have to Terastallize to be good, your options are much more limited and easily to play around. If you don't Terra for Avalugg, you'll have a bad Pokemon. And if the only way to make it a decent one is to Terastallize it, then you miss out on potentially Terastallizing any of your other 5 Pokemon you might really need or want to. Additionally, Avalugg was the victim of a nasty Gen 9 nerf. It only has 8 recovery PP now, as opposed to its previous 16, making wearing it down with repeated hits over time a good deal more feasible. Admittingly, gaining stab body press was nice, but not enough for Avalugg to make any waves in OU or UU. It found itself where it remains at the time of this video, with a decent yet limited row in RU. It's still held back by its pre-Terra typing, but the lower power level and the relative lack of knockoff makes it easier for Ice Avalugg to find use, which it can effectively Terastallize into Fairy, Ghost, or Fighting type that allows it to more effectively tangle with threats like Heracross. It's still more on the passive side, but Avalugg has a decent RU niche for the time being. And that's it. So how good was Avalugg actually? Well, it's a Pokemon of extremes. Insane physical defenses with reliable recovery and the utility of Rapid Spin, coupled with the worst defensive typing in the game, horrible speed and special defense, and minimal offensive output. Its niches have been limited accordingly. Its physical hit-taking ability is nice, but players eventually cease to use it upon realizing how passive it is in practice. It struggled to leave any sort of long-lasting impact in even the lowest tiers. That said, it did have a moment of glory in Gen 7 OU, where it staved off the most impossible to stop threat around and became a crucial part of certain stall teams. That too didn't last, but it was still pretty awesome. Hopefully though, its Hisuian form will bring Avalugg some greater success. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Avalugg? What would you give it to make it do something in OU when it's not a niche? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much to the patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.